The first speaker of the second panel is Abhijan Toto. He is an independent curator and writer and co-founder with Pochita Guha of the Forest Curriculum and is based in Bangkok, Thailand. He has previously worked as assistant curator at the Dhaka Art Summit and the Sandami Art Foundation, Bangladesh, Balas Art Project, Melina and Bautan, the Philippines, and with Council in Paris and Asian Archive. He has been awarded the 2019 Lorenzo Bonaldi Curatorial Prize. And he selected recent exhibitions include Realigning the Asian Art Biennial, part of Southern Constellations, Museum of Modern Art, Ljubljana. The Exhaustion Project, There is Still Work to Be Done. Hardcover Berlin, History Zero, Mumbai Art Room, Mumbai. And Abhijan Toto's presentation today is about the recent project he initiated called the Forest Curriculum on Zomia Adjacencies.
Should I start? Okay, fantastic. Okay, I'm going to start by thanking Nikita and Mia for asking me to be part of this absolutely fabulous series. It's been really, really amazing listening to all the other speakers. And sort of over the course of the last few days, we've kind of been going into a lot of sort of the ideas that I'm going to be revisiting and going into and tying together through the course of this presentation. We heard just now from Orville about this question of revisiting and reframing shamanism, and I think that's something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit. I'm really happy to have so many friends here who have, in several ways, through conversation, through practice, through collaboration, contributed to the Forest Curriculum, and I want to apologize to them if I repeat myself over and over again. We've had very long, extensive conversations or rants on my end about this. So I want to start, well, it's really interesting to be talking about this here in Berlin because the Forest Curriculum, as I'm sure many of you are aware about the Anthropocene curriculum, and part of the reason we chose this title, it does, of course, describe what we're trying to do, but part of the reason we chose this title was also as a bit of a fuck you to the Hakave and this idea of the Anthropocene curriculum. The Anthropocene curriculum as a project is fantastic, and they're doing very important work. However, it's more a fuck you to this idea of institutional co-option and what institutions are able and unable to do. Institutions as such remain a force of extractivist, extractivist politics. They extract and they accumulate, and there are channels of distribution. These channels of distribution are thought of as secondary and not primarily entangled with the process of knowledge creation. And this is sort of the space from which we're trying to operate. This is sort of the shift that we're trying to produce through this. I'm also kind of reeling from several conversations we had last night with my fantastic collaborators here, who were also part of previous conversations about finance, and we've been talking about this idea of working as both a think tank as well as to be doing in the world, and thinking of these as necessarily intertwined processes. So I'm going to be going back and forth across a lot of these kind of ideas over the course of this talk. But I want to start as well with something that Ming and I were talking about yesterday. I love starting with this one. So, because I've been having conversations about Fred Moten and Stefano Hani, which I'm sure if this is Berlin, everyone's familiar with them, about their work quite a lot, and they have been a major source of inspiration for us. Because I wanted to also think about this question of the para, since we are in the context of the para-curatorial symposium, as loose as that definition is, both productively and sometimes frighteningly. So I wanted to think about this question of what the para-curatorial can do and what it can kind of set out to map out and to be able to produce. So, the reason we start thinking with Fred Moten and Stefano Hani is that what we're essentially trying to, we learned a lot from Black Studies, we learned a lot from those forms of methodology of being able to infiltrate, be both between and across the space of the university. The space of the university, I think, is a very important one to kind of reconsider right now, because, as we're, anyone here who's sort of vaguely associated with a museum, within a university context, will know that sort of around the world we're at a place where the university is sort of being neoliberalized and privatized and sold for parts. And this is the case whether you're here in Europe or in the Americas, or particularly in Asia, of course. But I mean, and there's, and we've seen huge numbers of student protests happening across these spaces, which are attempting to resist this process. But at the same time, we're also forced to also take a moment to consider the university as always having been designed as a space of exclusion, as a space of, as I was mentioning, the space of accumulation of knowledge, of producing and bolstering an ivory tower sensibility. It goes out into the world only to be able to fill its own libraries with knowledge that doesn't get circulated beyond sort of very specific contexts. So how do we begin to think of an alter-university that is able to take on a networked form where we're able to think with forms of accountability, or with communities that we're working with that are never left out of discourses, that are able to both speak back but also manipulate the processes within these forms of knowledge? And how do we make them not only people that we are speaking for or speaking or speaking on behalf of, but rather make them mutual stakeholders in this process of the production and circulation of knowledge. And so this is kind of how we are thinking about this question of the criminal. The question of the criminal also comes up a lot because of the sort of the context that we're working with, which is the context of Zomia, which I'm going to come to quite soon. So just a little bit of a brief background. The Forest curriculum is a platform for in- and anti-disciplinary research and co-learning that attempts to reorient forms of knowledge away from the planetarity of the Anthropocene towards an ecosophical mode of thinking rooted in the cosmologies of nature cultures of Zomia, the forested belt that connects South and Southeast Asia. Simple enough. So I want to unpack a few of these terms that go into this definition. I want to start, as we on the topic of the university. I want to start with this question of indisciplinarity, and this is a term that I've begun to use in conversation with a fantastic writer, philosopher, artist from Beirut, Jessica Khajrik, who proposed this model of indisciplinarity as an addendum to forms of multidisciplinarity or pluridisciplinary thinking, and to be able to break down disciplinary boundaries completely, to be able to develop, therefore, new methodologies which are able to move across different spaces, both within the arts, academics, and other forms of practice, that are able to produce new modes of methodology with which to engage with the world. And so that's kind of what we're trying to develop over the course of the Forest curriculum, Forest curriculum's existence. And the Forest curriculum is run by myself and Pujita, but we are not it. We are not. We are merely its sort of shamans, its co-directors, and we allow for situations that manifest the Forest curriculum in certain contexts, but at the same time it has an existence way beyond us, and we're always looking for spaces where it can be appropriated by other forms of actors to be able to work with the context that they are in. And then, sorry? Oh, okay. That was already out of time. So, it's like, I didn't think I spoke that long. And then to think, therefore, about this question of moving away from the planetarity of the Anthropocene, and this is something that was sort of the starting point of why we decided to do this. I mean, we all kind of know, the post-human critique of the Anthropocene as always being centered around this question of man. I'm not going to, this is Berlin, we're not going to go into that in great detail here. Of course, we can over drinks later. But what I wanted to talk about was more specifically the question of the cosmological, which was something that we felt quite strongly when we were thinking about these descriptions of the Anthropocene, as we see them, which are very rooted in sort of Judeo-Christian ideas of apocalypses. It's always about the world ending in fire, of like heat and brimstone. And it was this imagination that we were beginning to think about how to counter. As we've said in multiple places, the world will not end because the world has ended, and the world will continue to end again and again and again. And it's this continuous ending, this co-implication across multiple frames of time, and this coexistence across multiple worlds that we were trying to tap into and begin to knit together into a larger form of critique. And not only of critique, but a larger form of action through the Project of the Forest curriculum. We see ourselves as being at least a 10-year initiative, of which we are only in year 2. And in these 2 years, we've been developing what will become the future methodologies through which we can work. So coming now to the terrain from which we work, Oval was talking really beautifully earlier about the question of roots and the weight of roots. And this is something that we want to think about quite a lot. But at the same time, I had a wonderful conversation yesterday about the presence of air as well, and the need to not only think about where one is rooted, but also how one lands. And this question of landing and also taking off and becoming aerial is something that I want to think about within this context as well. So Zomia, I'm sure many of you have seen the exhibition that was curated by Hyunjin Kim, which is called 2 or 3 Tigers, which is sort of where this comes from a little bit. It's a real privilege to have Professor Lee over here with us talking about his work, which brought a lot of these questions together and was able to articulate a form for this. I mean, Zomia has become the framework for a lot of artistic practice, both within the region and without. It's something of an almost romantic idea, and it's a very, very generative space. So Zomia, as you can read, I'm not going to read this entire thing out here. So can I go to the next slide? Yeah. Zomia is this region, this is from James C. Scott's book, that kind of extends from the northeast of Thailand into Cambodia, into Vietnam, into the southeast of China, into the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh, and further into the northeast of India. In our definition of Zomia, we also trace it into the Malay Peninsula and further into the Philippines, not only thinking about the presence of forests or of uninterrupted landmass, which is how James C. Scott goes about it, but also thinking about sort of very shared histories and continuous presence. What Zomia allows us to do is it allows us to escape the state quite immediately when we're thinking from Zomia. This question of the state becomes almost secondary. The state tends to disappear into the leaves of the forests in Southeast Asia, and sometimes you can hear it coming, but then you always know where to hide. And so Zomia, as James C. Scott theorized it, has been this kind of organizing principle, not principle of an organization, of various hill tribes and communities that have kind of always existed in a parallel relationship to the state for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then into the 20th century, what we see happening is that this becomes also the space of resistance by communist movements, by guerrillas, by other forms of society who become persona non grata within the definition of the state. I think yesterday, Sang Yujin, who is not here with us today, unfortunately, was talking about Chitpumisak, who is a Thai poet, scholar, and activist who was part of the forest guerrilla movement in the 70s. To go into the forest in a lot of Southeast Asian languages means to become a communist, and this euphemism continues till this day. So we're trying to imagine a way of thinking through these histories, but also at the same time continuous presence. So this space that we're looking at is also one of the most contested spaces today. Indigenous communities are continuously being dispossessed at an alarming rate. The northeast of India is one of the most heavily militarized zones in the world as well, which has been occupied by the Indian government Oh, I'm probably going to get arrested for that. But anyway, but has been occupied by the Indian government illegally ever since independence. The Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh have also been occupied by the Bangladeshi government, both of East Pakistan and subsequently of the modern state of Bangladesh. And this continues all the way into the Philippines, where you have the longest, I would say, most successful armed guerrilla movement anywhere in the world, who kind of have a parastate that continues to exist alongside the actual Philippine government, and they have some of the most progressive laws even within the Philippines, which is quite amazing. They legalized same-sex marriage like decades ago, for instance. So Zomia becomes this zone through which we're able to not only pay attention and pay tribute to these kinds of histories, but actually understand how these histories intrude upon the present. One of the main things that we're also thinking about is not only the occupation of space, but the occupation of time. As we know, colonialism, one of colonialism's longest standing wounds has been the appropriation of time into a linear formulation, and this is something that we're trying to interrupt through this turn towards Zomia, wherein the presence of the ghost, the presence of the weretiger, allow us to experience time not as having been past, but pasts, presents, and futures coexisting together. A ghost is nothing except the past intruding into the future, but being seen in the present. So it becomes a way of both paying tribute to these generations of modes of resistance, but also thinking about the formulation of identity as we understand it today. One of the things that working alongside this terrain of Zomia allows you to do is it allows you to quite immediately escape the very rigid and quite toxic space of moral identity politics that we're kind of all being forced to inhabit now. And it's really interesting to kind of think about this in relation to the show that is, at the Times Arts Center right now, because Trinity Minha is, I think, thinking through a lot of these questions as well. Because what tends to happen is that you begin to immediately find ways in which the trees somehow magically transform you across supposedly rigid identities of gender, identities of state. You can enter into the forest as a Laotian migrant and come out of it as a Thai resident. You can enter the forest as a Japanese insurgent and come out as an American double agent or a triple agent acting on your own behalf, as Ho Tzu Nian's fantastic work tends to show us. And so this is something else that I wanted to kind of tie into the methodology that we're trying to work with. We are not trying to do anything new, and I think this is something that I want to stress and emphasize a lot, because in the art world, we tend to be quite obsessed with the constant production of the new, even though we constantly tell ourselves that we left that idea of modernity behind. We don't seem to have quite done that. So rather than trying to invent new things, we're trying to find modes of tying things together. I'm going to quote Laura, who gave me this fantastic formulation yesterday, which is to think about not forms of making things new, but rather to think of mechanisms of coordination, which is what we're trying to imagine. Which is what we're trying to imagine through this as a process. So I'm going to read a little bit from this. Zomia resists easy, reproducible navigability and the logic of data. So, and this is something else that I wanted to talk about. One of the main sort of challenges of resistance that we're seeing right now, for instance, we're seeing this in Hong Kong, is the use of large-scale data infrastructures in the controlling of resisting bodies. And what the forest does in its sort of immediate unnavigability is that it constantly foils the ability to be turned into data, because unlike the other spaces through which the Anthropocene has been theorized, the sea and the desert, or the wasteland, which are spaces that can be broken down into units and therefore be processed and be thought of in these data units, the forest sort of naturally, through the density of its leaves, through the density of its sort of architecture of height, depth, and its sort of confounding spaces immediately begins to subvert the ways the data regimes are able to work, and which is why, I mean, even yesterday, the metaphor of the forest comes in a lot into conversations about engineering systems of data in terms of resistance. So, infrastructures of state and control crumble, machines rust and become haunted. Radio waves pick up the conversations of ghosts. Zomia occupies a queer relation to states, subverting their ideologies and providing routes of navigating their hegemonies, creating a space where agency becomes doubled, tripled, multiplied, and identity becomes slippery and changes with the rates of exchange. This is also to think about not only Zomia as a space where identity is being changed, but also forms of economy are constantly invented. I'll talk about this a little bit more at length later, but one of the things, for instance, that we've become very interested in is sort of the drug economy of the Shan state and the forms of kind of almost crypto economy that they have to kind of invent on a almost in a very tangible fashion, in an almost everyday way, to be able to create these forms of resistance. So the economic as another space of speculation comes into this quite a lot. One can enter Zomia, a Laotian fleeing persecution, and emerge from the jungle Thai, an American double agent or a Chinese or Japanese triple agent, tattooed with the markings of the weretigers and ghosts that roam the region. Here, pagan cultures entangle with colonial histories, the Baroque with the animistic, the kitschy video games double up with the silent tiptoes of guerrilla warfare. In Zomia, there is no post-colonial, but rather entangled histories of imperialism that occur not as geological layers, but rather contemporaneously and all at once. And this is something I want to kind of talk about this a little bit. So I'm based right now in Thailand, and Thailand, as many of you will know, has never officially been colonized. But as anyone who's read the work of Thongchani Winichakul, who is a fantastic scholar, activist, who was part of the Thammasat University movement, which ultimately led to the massacre, has theorized the internal colonization of Siam, which provides us a very, very interesting model from which to think about what we normally refer to as post-colonial states as never having been post-colonial in any sense. They merely reproduce the structures of power that existed both before into the new form of the colonial government, and therefore are able to produce newer and stricter forms of control across these spaces. In Zomia, the Zomia is a vibrant space teeming with life and affection, technology and history, enfolding whatever passes through it. It is a fold, architecturally dense, complex and vexing, but also folding, engulfing the outside unto and within itself. Zomia vividly questions the rigorous boundaries of the outside and the inside, the public and the private, the historical and the sensual. Pleats and curves, billows of fabric. It is a labyrinthine twist with space and history, a meandering landscape of inflections and inclensions, forces and energies, continuities and contiguities. Zomia, thus, is possibly the end of a secure overview, a unilinear scale from which events could be mapped. In fact, the death of a secure scale is a very pronouncement of the is a very pronouncement of the Zomia/Southeast Asian forests. Its enormity, its immeasurability, its incalculability forces one to confront a nettling kirtle of foliage. Zomia belies traditional concepts of both what an object is and what comprehension could mean. The ramifications are endless, dispersing, and more often than not, hidden. And so I want to stop here a little bit and talk about this question of the hidden. And so we've been talking a lot about obscurity and producing regimes of obscurity, and I want to think about this in relationship to the curatorial. The curatorial often is about controlling and producing architectures and sites of vision, and this is something that we kind of have to turn back on its head when we're working in this context. As many of you will know, many of the quote-unquote republics, kingdoms, et cetera, within the space that we're talking about are either dictatorships or brutal governments. So in this context, to be able to produce vision often becomes to the detriment of the things that we're trying to say. So producing necessary obscurities and producing networks through which the obscurities can become circulated and become operationalized has become part of the way that we understand the curatorial within this space. The forest curriculum proposes Zomia as a terrain from which to create the Anthropocene, a project, as the post-human critics of this idea have pointed out, assumes universality of a Western model of the human, which in practice has been used by imperialists and state actors to exploit and impoverish those outside, or from a different framework in a subaltern position to its definition. And yet, the curriculum is not a project on dwelling and subsistence, locality and nativity, territorial cliches and essences. It travels and settles, ebbs and flows, glides through scales and times at once. The curriculum asks, what roles do objects and matter take on in different histories? What shape and function do they mutate into? Do matter and its Hades-ian cousin waste render alchemic properties secretly secrete an unspeakable life force, a mythical savior, one whose life energy is incomparable, a potential formative force of history itself? The curriculum thus looks into a world where objects become subjects, acquire their own presences, enter into constellations, events, and processes. So, I mean, again, here, of course, if those who are readers of Viveros Castro will kind of see where we're kind of coming into with this, this kind of animistic vision of a multinaturalist world. It affirms that so-called inanimate beings have a life, and that deep within resides an inexplicable vitality or energy, its independence and resistance to human power. As we wage and wager through the rubric of human exceptionalism, we ask, what forms of relation can we and do we have with the ecological itself? Are animals merely the sights/the signs that speak for a fallen man, his primordial instincts, his base capacities for affect and motion? Or are the innumerable myths from the Zomia they speak of, are they our kith and kin, our ancestors, our cousins, or our mortal enemies in a different corporeal garb? Like the weretigers, drifting between the hunter and the hunted, we ask, what is the space between nature and society? What social relations can bring us closer to the world that we inhabit? I mean, the weretiger is a figure that we come back to over and over again, as many of you who are familiar with the work of Ho Tzu Nyen will know a little bit about the idea of the weretiger. The weretiger is one of those myths that occurs across the Zomian context. A very, very popular form of this myth is a British or a Dutch or some colonial officer comes to a village and asks the villagers, so how many tigers are there in this region? And the villagers very confidently tell him, well, 2 or 3. And the villagers, the officers, quite understandably perplexed by this answer, and asked him, what do you mean by 2 or 3? He says, well, it depends on Haru's grandmother's mood. Sometimes she lives with us as a human and makes us lovely meals every Sunday, and sometimes she goes into the forest and hunts us, and we never know which is going to happen every day. And so, coming now to actually thinking about case studies, as I was kind of asked to, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the things that we're actually doing and unpack a little bit the spaces that we're trying to occupy. I'm really fortunate to have Solveig Suez here, who is from Geocinema, who lent us this amazing image of the Ramasun base camp, which is one of the spaces that we're kind of continuously going back to. Through this process, one of the things that we've become very, very involved in is unpacking the long history of the Cold War, which has never ended, and trying to unpack its infrastructural modalities and unpack the legacies that they had. So Ramasun is a fantastic site in the northeast of Thailand, which is used by the CIA during the American War in Vietnam. I refuse to use the nomenclature of the Vietnam War, but the American War in Vietnam as a listening station, as a site through which they ran a lot of their psychological operations and propaganda missions. The image you see here is of the Elephant Cage, which was one of the largest listening stations that was created as an infrastructure of war during this period and continues to exist as this kind of haunted geography even today. And I'd be happy to share a little bit more about this later, but I don't think there's time. This project really emerges out of film, and it emerges out of thinking alongside filmmakers. So I wanted to I wanted to include this slide because Laura is also part of this fantastic show. Laura is somebody we've been very fortunate to be in conversation with in a very long-term manner. thinking about these mappings between Zomia and Amazonia, and this sort of the spaces and contexts that bind the two together. And of course, the work of Lav Diaz has been another very important point of departure. So we work a lot with film, both in terms of screening programs and commissioning new film projects, in developing ideas alongside filmmakers. But the main part of what I'm supposed to be talking about is the summer school that we initiated this year, and it was going to be an annual program that's going to be happening in different sites across the Zomian context. And it's a 3-week program that we premiered in June, which existed as a series of modules led by a number of fantastic artist researchers from around the region, as well as activists, scholars, academics, and other forms of practitioners. We were fortunate to have, for example, Shan from the Philippines, who works with the Aita community in northern Luzon, and has been developing for a long time forms of counter mapping as forms of resistance, and developing methodologies alongside indigenous communities, as in developing ways to which to counteract land grabbing, which is a huge problem in the Philippines, especially sort of from a very feudal context. So this is a slide from one of the modules that he produced. We see one of the maps that somebody produced doing this. We had as well activists and scholars based within indigenous communities. So Chumsak Nararatwong, who's from the south of Thailand, has been working with the Orang Asli community for a long time, and was discussing his work with the cosmological frameworks of the Orang Asli, which is part of sort of the speculative framework that we're trying to develop. And at the same time, we were talking yesterday a lot about the question of accountability and responsibility, and how do we become responsible to the communities that we're working with. And so we constantly created sites and moments through which the participants, we tried to create a completely non-hierarchical space when the participants were able to co-opt the space in summer school into alternative discussions that came from the motivations of the politics with which they were engaged. So here we see readings and performances that kind of spontaneously emerged during the course of the program earlier this year. This one by Omar Wasim, was a fantastic artist from Pakistan. And we've been thinking, as I said, in an interdisciplinary manner, and part of this has also been thinking across different materialities. So thinking through sound has been an important part of the way that we are involved in this. Part of this also came out of thinking about the American War in Vietnam, where sound and the sonic was was hugely weaponized against the Viet Cong by the Americans, largely ineffectively because of American incompetence. Wherein there's this fantastic operation that they ran called Operation Wandering Soul. I wish Song was here with us today, who's been researching this for many, many years, where they had American soldiers wear backpacks with speakers mounted on the back, and they had tapes which were supposedly a dead Viet Cong soldier talking to his wife and kids, telling them to lead the resistance and to surrender to the Americans because the resistance is absolutely futile, laid over with what they thought were Vietnamese funeral chants, but were completely wrong. And so it didn't so much scare the Vietnamese as much as confuse them. And so thinking alongside sound, thinking alongside the work of Jose Maceda has been really important, and a number of other figures. So largely, so this is, I think I'm out of time, right? Okay, so I'm going to kind of wrap this up with sort of this kind of final thought. The Forest Curriculum is an itinerant system of pedagogy that proposes to work with academics, filmmakers, artists, musicians, activists, and students and local stakeholders to produce systems of sharing located knowledges organized around the issues of a particular location and the field of operation. In the moment of the crisis of the liberal university under attack from fascist and neoliberal forces, the curriculum proposes a model of nomadic and parasitic institutionality that works through furthering entanglement and creating situations of mutual stakeholding of knowledge. It seeks to imagine what forms of politics and pedagogies must be invented to think alongside and become intimate with the many beings of the many worlds we inhabit. Structured around a lexicon and a bestiary whose denizens haunt, navigate, and interfere with the choreographies of knowledges that the project composes, the curriculum exists and grows through each iteration and deployment. We are orchestrating situations of mutual co-learning. Each iteration oozes into the project, entangles into each successive deployment, creating transversal networks across Zomian fields. Equally, the curriculum opens itself up to appropriation by stakeholders who call an iteration into being and produce itineraries unforeseen by its initiators. So that's sort of the larger framework that I wanted to introduce to you guys. Thank you so much for being a very patient audience.